In the fall of 1942, the city of Stalingrad had become a living hell. The ruined streets, half-burned buildings, black smoke, and scattered screams had shaped the face of a city that no longer bore any signs of normal life. In those days, a military train arrived from the east, and among hundreds of fresh-faced soldiers, a man with calm, precise eyes stepped onto the city's trembling soil. Vasily Grigorievich Zaitsev, a former hunter from the Ural Mountains. Zaitsev was the son of a peasant family who had learned the art of patience and precision from childhood by hunting deer, wolves, and bears. His rifle was not a tool for killing, but a means of survival. In war, this ability became a weapon that could change the fate of the battle. When he joined the 62nd Red Army, no one knew that among the masses of tired and hungry soldiers stood a man who would soon become a symbol of the resistance of a nation. In the first days of his stay in Stalingrad, the situation on the front was catastrophic. German forces had occupied almost the entire western part of the city, and only a narrow strip of the Volga River remained in Soviet hands. Troops were transferred across the river under direct fire from artillery and Luftwaffe aircraft. Corpses floated on the water, and new recruits came under enemy fire the moment they stepped ashore. In such a hell, Zaitsev was initially deployed on the front lines as an ordinary sniper. His rifle was an ordinary Mosin Nagant, without a scope. But in the very first days, his skill attracted the attention of commanders. In his first week, he reportedly killed more than 30 targets with precise, silent fire, often at distances that would have seemed impossible to anyone else. Stalingrad was a city without streets. Every building, every wall, every brick had become a barricade. The fighting took place at close quarters. Sometimes the enemy was only a few meters away. In such an environment, snipers became a vital element. They were the eyes and breath of the army, and each accurate shot destroyed not just an enemy soldier, but a part of the enemy's morale. Zaitsev moved from one ruin to another at night. During the day, he carefully surveyed enemy trenches, following every little sign, a flash of light from a camera, a shadow moving on a wall, or the rustle of clothing amid the rubble. He became famous for his deadly patience. Once, he is said to have spent more than a full day in sub-zero temperatures, motionless behind the carcass of a dead horse, waiting for the right moment to take aim at a German officer who was surveying the situation. But what distinguished Zaitsev was not just his skill, it was his analytical mind and his method of training. He soon began training a group of young snipers, a group that would later become known as the Zaitsev School. He taught his students that shooting was not just about aiming, but also about recognizing the enemy's rhythm, analyzing the environment, and waiting for the moment when everything fell into place. In late November, as the Germans intensified their attacks to completely capture the city, Zaitsev and his students became a nightmare for the Wehrmacht soldiers. German intelligence reports repeatedly referred to the ghost sniper of Stalingrad, a man who no one knew where he was shooting from or how he disappeared. This nickname made Zaitsev a mythical figure on both sides of the front. At night, he would jot down the results of each mission in a small notebook, the number of targets, the distance, the wind conditions, the position of the light, not for bragging rights, but for analysis and learning. His notebook later became a testament to the precise, cool mind of a man who saw war as an equation. By the end of his first month, official figures said Zaitsev had destroyed more than 100 targets with pinpoint accuracy. But more importantly, his presence breathed new life into the Soviet forces. Amid the devastation of Stalingrad, when all seemed lost, his quiet shot
was a reminder that there was still someone to resist, someone who with every bullet crushed the enemy's pride and kept hope alive. It was in those days that the German commanders decided to respond, and this was the beginning of one of the most famous sniper duels in history.
Winter had arrived in Stalingrad. The temperature sometimes reached -40 degrees, and the snow, smothered with smoke and ash, covered the city like a gray canvas. In this cold, rifles froze, fingers became numb, and the soldiers' breath evaporated and froze in the same instant. But Zaitsev, in the midst of this deadly cold, was more precise and calm than ever. He was no longer a simple soldier. He was a well-known face among the Red Army. Every time a single shot rang out from the ruins, the soldiers knew Zaitsev has done his job. In the small outposts and defensive lines, his name was repeated like a legend. The man the Germans feared would not even raise his head from the trenches. But this fame also awakened the enemy. German intelligence, concerned about the morale of their soldiers on the Eastern Front, received a report. A Soviet sniper was destroying officers and middle commanders, disrupting the coordination of units. The order came from Berlin. This man must be found and destroyed. In those days, Zaitsev, along with his companions, Danilov, Nikolai Kulikov, and several other students, were stationed in the ruins around the abandoned metallurg factory. They spent their days in silence among the smoke and rubble. Every morning, before the sky completely cleared, they examined the situation. From which window could the enemy appear? From what angle did the sun reflect off the snow? How could one distinguish the direction of the wind from the smoke of a fire? During these days, Zaitsev uttered a phrase that was later recorded in his memoirs. A sniper should be like a shadow. The shadow sees, but is not seen. He casts a shadow, but no one hears him. He practiced with his students how to guess the situation from the slightest movement of the enemy. If you hear the sound of metal, he is just moved. If there is complete silence, he is thinking. At the same time, unofficial news spread among Soviet officers. The German army had sent a special sniper to Stalingrad, a man from the elite Berlin school, Major König. His goal was one thing: to kill Zaitsev. At first, this rumor seemed like a legend, but gradually, signs confirmed it. For several days in a row, 3 of the best Soviet snipers were killed in silence and without any signs. The bullets were fired accurately and silently from a great distance. Zaitsev understood. The hunter had now become the hunted. Since then, the atmosphere on the front has changed. The goal was no longer simply to kill the enemy. A battle of minds had begun. Both men were searching for each other in the ruins of a ruined city. Every shot could be the end of one of them, but not just by bullets, by mistake, by haste, or even by a small reflection of light from a camera lens. Zaitsev and his companion Kulikov crawled for days among the wreckage of buildings, using smoke for cover and watching for every reflection of light. König, on the other hand, hid his position with the calmness of a trained professional officer. Both had months of experience in manhunts in their minds, but in this field, a mistake meant only one thing. For 3 whole days, neither fired a shot. A deathly silence reigned over the field. The soldiers on the other front did not know where the 2 men were, but they sensed a hidden war going on among the rubble. A silent war, but more deadly than any major battle. On the 3rd day, at dawn, a faint reflection was seen from behind a pile of bricks. Zaitsev smiled, not with joy, but with recognition. "He's there," he said quietly to Kulikov, "but he wants me to think I'm wrong." 2 minds, 2 guns, 2 nations, and a ruined city between them. The battle had not yet begun, but both knew that the end would come only for one. Amid the cold, lifeless ruins of Stalingrad, where the sound of the wind mingled with the groans of the burning buildings, Zaitsev and Kulikov waited in heavy silence. The air was heavy. The smell of metal and blood hung in the air, and any sound could mean the end. His breath. Time stood still for a few seconds. Kulikov, beside him, whispered, "Do you see it?" Zaitsev only shook his head slightly. Wait, not yet. He is testing me. Two men on either side of the ruins were engaged in a cruel mental game. König, the German officer, crept slowly from behind the rubble, raising his camera a millimeter without casting a shadow on the snow. He was a master of discipline and patience, trained to hunt in silence. He believed that no man could escape his gaze. But Zaitsev, a child of the Urals, had grown up hunting wolves and bears since childhood. He knew how to use the wind and the light and the earth to hide. The duel began. Both stood motionless, less than 100 meters apart in the mutual ruins. Both knew that the first to move might be making their last mistake. Hours passed. The snow settled softly on their rifles. The sun rose and set again. Even time had lost its breath. At dawn the next day, Zaitsev decided to make a plan. "He's not afraid of me," he told Kulikov, "but he's proud. Being proud is his weakness." Then he set up a piece of metal a few meters away to reflect the sunlight, exactly the same reflection he had seen yesterday from König. Now the game was reversed. He had made a decoy that would tempt the enemy. A few hours later, a faint shot came from the enemy's side. The bullet passed Zaitsev's face and lodged in the wall behind him. König had been fooled. There was no second shot, only silence. Zaitsev, calmly and carefully, used the brief reflection of the smoke from the shot to find the enemy's approximate position. But he still had doubts. He couldn't shoot indiscriminately. He made a plan with Kulikov. Kulikov would show himself a little from the other side, as if he had taken Zaitsev's place so that the enemy would react. A few moments later, Kulikov slowly raised his head from the corner of the wall. The sound of a shot. The bullet hit the target. Kulikov fell, motionless. Zaitsev held his breath. "Goodbye, comrade," he whispered. But now he knew the enemy's position. He leaned his rifle against the brick wall, measured the exact angle. He knew that König had hidden himself behind an iron plate, leaving only a small gap for observation. He had to shoot from that gap precisely, without missing a millimeter. A few minutes of absolute silence. Zaitsev calculated the wind in his mind, measured the angle of the light, and he fired. The sound of metal breaking. After a few seconds, no movement was seen from the enemy's side. Then, the sound of a muffled sigh faded into the wind. Zaitsev did not smile. He just slowly lowered his head and stared silently at the snow. The next day, while inspecting the area, Soviet soldiers found the body of a German officer with a gold medal and a Mauser rifle with a special scope. A plaque around his neck read H. König. Zaitsev, without any reaction, looked at the fallen officer. He was a good hunter, but here, no one escapes the shadows, he said. From that day on, the legend of the battle between Zaitsev and König spread across the front. Two men, two nations, two guns, and a city in flames. But no one ever really understood whether König really existed. Perhaps he was just a figment of the imagination of soldiers searching for a hero in the hell of Stalingrad to keep their hope alive. But in Zaitsev's memoirs, one sentence always recurs. In Stalingrad, there were no heroes. There were only people who did not want to die.
In the days following the deadly duel, the snow continued to fall.
and the city slowly buried itself under a layer of ash and silence. Zaitsev hid in a makeshift shelter in the basement of an abandoned hospital. The sounds of the wounded wailed in the distance, and the smell of blood mingled with the smell of oil and smoke. There was no longer any clear day or night, just a cycle of fear, waiting, and survival. He sat in the dark for hours, his eyes fixed on the cracked wall, his mind replaying the moment of the shot over and over again. The sound of metal, the reflection of light, and then silence. Had he really killed König? Or was there another enemy waiting in the shadows to catch up with him? A few days later, Zaitsev, on the orders of his unit commander, returned to his frontline positions. The snow was now soaked with blood. The streets of Stalingrad were nothing but piles of bricks, iron, and corpses. The air was thick with dust and soot, and every building was a death trap. Amid the ruins, Zaitsev sought a new position. He was now a legend, a soldier with eagle eyes and the specter of death in the ruins. But inside, weariness and emptiness welled up. With every bullet he fired, another human face crossed his mind. The enemy no longer had a face for him. He was just a shadow. Shadows that came and went. One day, as the pale winter sun rose over the Volga River, Zaitsev saw a face in the smoke. A young girl in a nurse's uniform searching through the rubble for the wounded. He had seen her before, Tanya, a nurse from Leningrad. Her gaze was calm but determined. "You're Zaitsev, aren't you? People are talking about you. They say that no goal escapes your grasp." Zaitsev smiled bitterly. Does anyone talk about those who didn't escape? From that day on, Tanya would sometimes accompany him to deliver ammunition and medical supplies. Amid the fire and death, something had developed between them. A kind of peace, perhaps a small hope. At night, when the sound of the bombing stopped for a moment, they would talk about the days when the war would end, about the Volga, about a Russia that was still alive. But in Stalingrad, hope didn't last long. During one of the clearing operations, while Zaitsev and his group were holed up in an abandoned building, a bomb fell from the sky. The explosion tore down the wall. Smoke filled the air. When Zaitsev opened his eyes, he saw Tanya lying motionless in the rubble. With bloody hands, he tried to pull her out. But it was too late. He said under his breath, "You said we'd go to the Volga together when the war was over. Now only I will go. Only I." From that day on, his voice was no longer heard on the army radio. Zaitsev fired less, spoke less, but every time he raised his rifle, a precise, deadly shot would be fired, not out of anger, but out of a promise he had made to himself. Winter was drawing to a close, and the German Sixth Army was surrounded. The Soviet soldiers were not celebrating. They were just staring at the city of which nothing was left. In the final days of the battle, when news of the German surrender arrived, Zaitsev sat on a ruined roof, buried his rifle in the snow, and looked at the horizon. The sun was faintly rising through the smoke, and the Volga River shone like a frozen ribbon in the distance. "It's over, but not for me," he muttered. No one knew what happened to him after that day. Some said he was wounded and blinded. Others said he went back to the front and disappeared into silence. But in the memory of the soldiers, his name remained with the quiet sound of a shot, the last shot, in a city that no longer breathed.
The bloody winter of Stalingrad was slowly dying down, but the ashes of war still swirled in the air. The snow was no longer white, but gray and stained with blood and gunpowder. The city was no longer a city. It was a ghost of civilization, where every brick had been trampled with human life. Zaitsev, with a tired face and eyes shining in the Siberian cold, walked among the ruins. The sound of another explosion had stopped, but the silence fell on the chest of the city, heavier than any bombardment. He headed for the Volga River, where he had crossed in the early days of the war to defend the city. Now he was returning the same way, but with a backpack of death, fear, and memories that no victory could erase. Along the way, he passed a burned-out tank. On its turret, a German soldier froze, his eyes wide open to the sky. Zaitsev paused, lowered his head, and muttered, "We all lost this war. Only some survived to see defeat." When he reached the riverbank, a cold wind blew from the east. Snow settled on his rifle, and he glanced at it, the same weapon that had been by his side through all the battles in the city. With numb fingers, he pulled out the buttstock and gently laid it down on the snow. In the distance, the sound of soldiers shouting, "Victory! The German army surrenders!" But there was no smile on Zaitsev's face. Victory meant nothing to him. What remained of this city were only the ghosts of those left among the rubble, his friends, his enemies, and Tanya. In a small notebook he always carried, he wrote, "In Stalingrad, we lost our humanity in order to survive. Now we must learn how to become human again." The wind flipped through the notebook. The sound of the paper turning was like the breathing of a city that still did not want to die. At that moment, a young officer approached him from behind. With a tired face, he saluted and said, "Comrade Zaitsev, the general wants to see you. They say they want to give you a medal." Zaitsev turned, looked at him calmly, and said, "Medal? For what? For killing more than the others?" The officer was silent. He had nothing to say. Zaitsev put his hand in the pocket of his gray coat and walked towards the river. The snow crumbled under his feet, leaving footprints that the wind would soon erase. He reached the riverbank, took a deep breath, and looked up at the sky. A faint light shone through the clouds. He closed his eyes and heard the sound of the river. Quiet, cold, but alive. A few days later, the soldiers did not see him again. His rifle was found by the river, covered in a layer of snow. No one knew where Zaitsev went. Maybe he went to another front. Maybe he disappeared silently into the snow. But his name remained in memory, in reports, in soldiers' legends, in the quiet voices of snipers who later fired on other battlefields and muttered, "For Zaitsev." Stalingrad rose from the ground, but it was never the same city. And every winter, when the snow settles on its ground, people say that in the silence of the city, the sound of a shot still rings out, lonely, precise, and silent.
The silence of the city after the fall of the Germans was heavier than ever. Stalingrad was breathing, but the sound of this breathing, like the cough of an old wounded man, came out of the rubble. The streets were full of the bent shadows of soldiers who had returned victorious from the war, but they did not resemble heroes. Their gaze was empty, their steps heavy, and each of them carried the burden of death. Zaitsev walked among them without saying anything. The snow settled on his shoulders and did not fall. He passed through the ruins of the building that had once been called Pavlov's house, the same bastion that had resisted for months. Now only half-collapsed walls remained of it, and in their midst a torn cloth flag flapping in the wind. He sat by a broken window, looked up at the sky, and remembered the days when he had watched over the enemies from here. Every shot, every breath, every drop of sweat in the cold. But now there was nothing left but emptiness. A voice came from behind, an elderly man in a thick gray overcoat and with many medals on his chest. It was a general. "Comrade Zaitsev, Leningrad is liberated, Berlin is coming. These victories are from men like you." Zaitsev looked at him calmly. "Victory? General, you see victory on the map,
I see it in the dead eyes of my comrades." The general was silent for a moment. Maybe he understood. Maybe he was just pretending. Then he took an envelope from his pocket. The Order of Honor of the Hero of the Soviet Union. Zaitsev looked at it, then said calmly, "Let there be heroes for those who still believe. I just survived. That's all." He didn't take the envelope. The general nodded reluctantly and walked away. The snow settled in his footsteps, erasing his tracks. Zaitsev was left alone. Night had spread over the city again. The sound of the river came from afar. Zaitsev walked along the Volga. The sky was not full of stars, only clouds and smoke. He looked at the water, the same water that thousands of men had crossed, some to defend themselves, some to die. He said silently, "We crossed this river to preserve life, but on the way, we left ourselves behind." A little later, he uncocked his rifle, placed it in the snow, and looked longingly at the sky. The cold moonlight fell on his face. He sat quietly, opened his notebook, and wrote the last sentence. "Every shot I fired testified to the fear that lives in man. I hope that one day a bullet will not be needed to defend oneself." The snow settled on the page. The ink spread. He closed the notebook, put it in his pocket, and stared at the river until dawn. The next morning, the soldiers who passed that way found only a trail of footsteps that went all the way to the river's edge and disappeared. His sniper rifle was left, unattended, in the snow. No one saw where Zaitsev went. Some said he returned to Siberia. Some said he fought again in the Battle of Berlin and disappeared. But the old men of the town still say, whenever winter comes and the snow falls heavily on Stalingrad, the sound of a single shot comes from afar, quiet, precise, and cold. Zaitsev's shot. It was a cold, foggy morning. The sun had not yet risen through the smoke and dust, and Stalingrad, once the heart of Soviet industry, now looked more like a vast cemetery. Zaitsev was walking down a street that no longer had a name. There were no signs, no windows, no signs of life. Only the crunch of snow under his boots broke the silence. He approached a building that had once been an elementary school. On the half-burnt wall, in childish handwriting, was still written, "We are the future of the homeland." Zaitsev looked at it for a long time. A faint smile spread across his lips, bitter, heavy, and brief. In his mind, he could hear the children's voices, the bell, the laughter, and then the sound of a bomb, the collapse of the roof, and the silence that had settled in that place forever. He went upstairs. Through one of the broken windows, he looked out at the city. The Volga River was frozen, and the gray light of the sky shone on its surface. Across the river, trucks and boats were still seen, carrying wounded soldiers back. The war was over, but the smell was still in the air. Zaitsev took out his notebook, the one he had with him since the first day of the war. He opened a new page and, with hands shaking from the cold, wrote, "We stayed here to defend the city, but the city did not defend us. We fought for the land, but the land buried us." Then he looked out the window. In the distance, smoke rose from the command building. News had come that General Paulus, commander of the German 6th Army, had surrendered. But there was no sign of joy on Zaitsev's face. He had seen that every victory had a price paid not in maps, but in the lifeless faces of soldiers and people who never returned. He slowly left the building. The snow was still falling, and the wind made a moaning sound through the broken walls. On the way, he listened to the sound of his own footsteps. Every step was reminiscent of a shot. Every breath, the smell of gunpowder. In the middle of the road, he stopped by a ruined wall and picked up a piece of broken glass from the ground. His image trembled in it. A face with a long beard, tired eyes, and a face that no longer resembled the young man who had once come from the Urals to defend his country. "We won the war, but we lost the man," he muttered. He went toward the river. The wind blew from the east, cold and merciless. When he reached the water's edge, he took his rifle from his shoulder. He closed his eyes, squeezed the metal barrel in his hands, and then gently placed it on the snow. He touched the river. The water was cold and alive. He said, "This river has witnessed everything. Our blood, our tears, our voices, but one day only its silence will remain." At that moment, a young soldier called out to him from afar, "Comrade Zaitsev, the commander is looking for you. They want to write about your war memories." Zaitsev turned, looked at him calmly, and smiled. "Write, but not about the war. Write about those who cannot speak anymore." And he left. Quietly, silently, in the snow. Days passed, and no one saw him again. Only his notebook was found months later in one of the bunkers. On the last page he wrote, "I don't want to aim anymore. The world itself has been shot enough." Over time, Stalingrad was rebuilt. Streets, factories, and life returned. But the townspeople said that on cold winter nights, a soft shot came from the river, lonely, precise, and unrepeatable.
The city had calmed down, but it was not the silence before the storm. It was more like the silence that had survived the war, but its soul was left scarred and bloody. Stalingrad, the ruins that had once been the heart of the battle, was now being rebuilt, but every wall and every street still held the memory of explosions and death. Zaitsev, who had lived for months among smoke, snow, and blood, still roamed the city, but his goal was no longer just to survive or kill. Now he was looking for something that might mean something to him, to restore humanity, or at least to glimpse it among the ruins. He walked through empty streets and half-collapsed buildings, the sound of snow under his feet his only companion. Every step he took brought back a memory, friends he had lost, enemies who had been buried in the shadows of ash, and people who had never seen victory. He came to a house that had once been full of life. Now only burnt walls and broken windows remained. Zaitsev sat down on a step, took a small notebook from his pocket, and took up his pen. He opened a new page and wrote, "This city tested us, tested our war, but it did not test our souls. Now when I look at the ruins, I understand that people die not with bullets, but with their memories." An hour later, he left the building and walked towards the Volga River. The river, once a battlefield, now flowed calmly and clear, but cold and merciless. Zaitsev sat by the water, dipping his hands in it, and his gaze fixed on the horizon. The snow settled softly on his shoulders, occasionally scattered by the wind. He remembered the days when he had crossed this river to shoot at the enemy, or when he had seen Tanya among the rubble and had been unable to save her. The sound of the footsteps of the fresh soldiers came from afar. One of them, young and determined, approached him and said, "Mr. Zaitsev, the commander wants to meet you. They want to record your story for future generations." Zaitsev looked at him for a long time and said with cold calm, "To record our story, but not for heroism, for a lesson. To remind us that war has no heroes. There are only survivors who must live with the memory of the dead." He opened the notebook again and wrote the last sentences. "This shot I fired, every drop of blood that was shed, testified to the fear and pain of mankind.
The day will come when no bullets will be needed to defend oneself. Closing the notebook, Zaitsev set off towards the river. He had no hope in his heart of returning to normal life, but he looked at the river and whispered, "As long as this water flows, there's still life." He walked slowly towards the snow, and his footsteps disappeared along the way to the edge of the river. Days and weeks passed, but no one saw him. Some said that he had returned to Siberia. Some said that he had gone to other fronts again, but no one was sure. All that remained was his little notebook and his rifle, which were found by the snow and the river. Years later, when the city came to life again and the buildings were rebuilt, people asked the old men, "Can you still hear the shots?" And the old men said, "Every winter, when the heavy snow settles on Stalingrad, the sound of a single shot is heard in the distance, precise, calm, and silent." The voice of Zaitsev, the legendary sniper who never returned, but whose name lives on in the memory of this city every winter. Zaitsev was no longer physically present, but his spirit lived on, with every snow that settled on the ruins, with every sound of the river and wind, with every whisper of the city. The city lived, but never forgot the war and the courage of those who survived it. And the story of Zaitsev, as a symbol of diligence, patience, and a man who remained amidst blood and ashes, was always associated with Stalingrad.
At the end of this journey into the darkness of history, perhaps only one thing is clear. War has no heroes, only tired, abandoned, and longing humans. All those armies, commanders, and flags eventually crumbled to the ground. What remained were the sounds of screams that were lost in the wind. We may think the past is over, but its traces are still in people's eyes, in black and white photos, in cities that were rebuilt, in the silence of soldiers who never returned. This history is not just a story of bullets. It is a story of humans. Humans who both build and destroy. If this video made you think about peace for even a moment, it has fulfilled its mission. The like or subscribe button may seem small, but every click you make helps the voice of awareness be heard louder, because the world still needs to be remembered. We may not be able to change the past, but we can learn from it. Learn that no victory is worth a mother's tears. Thank you for being with us until this moment. Until the next video, remember humanity.